Welcome to History and Politics Chat at 4 o'clock on Tuesdays. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but I do not speak for my employer when I do these talks. I also need to warn those of you who are here that because we have not had power, I haven't been on the news today like I normally do, which is normally pretty much a constant thing. I have been able to glance at it, but we have been saving generator power for the refrigerator and things like that. So I did get a chance to go ahead and take a look at some of your questions, and I'm going to be speaking about what I know about those things without having done the usual research, because the truth is I usually do a lot of research before I do these talks. So I'll do the best I can here. I want to start with questions about this election, and you can tell in the stuff that I've been writing, I've been trying to highlight President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, because one of the things that's really important, I think, in the way people think, and remember, I'm a person who studies the way people think. I believe that ideas change history. I'm an idealist. So I think a lot about how people think about things. And one of the problems that a society has when it has a very powerful leader, especially a negative powerful leader, is that our vision tends to be bounded by what that leader has put forward. So that if he says no, I say yes, or whatever, but we stay in that box and we think in that box. So one of the things that I've been trying to do in my letters is not to talk about that box, not to think about that box, because some of the boxes in which we are currently living are completely artificial. We don't have to live this way. This is how we are thinking we have to live because we're bound by that box. So I've been trying not to talk about Trump in my letters, but there's something really important going on, and I want to make sure that it doesn't get lost in the fact that people like me are trying not to talk about it. And that's the shenanigans around this election. And I want to start by pointing out that nobody in the Trump camp is arguing that he won a majority of the votes of the American people. In fact, he's lost by more than 6 million votes, which is a lot considering that there were things in place to make sure that Democrats couldn't vote. I mean, the whole fact that in Texas, for example, they got rid of drive-in voting, or only put one election box, drop box in a county, the state, the size of the state of Rhode Island, the fact that the United States Postal Service was slowed down in crucial areas. We now have the spreadsheets. You can look at those and you can see that in Kentucky, the mail was slowed down. In Detroit, the mail was slowed down. In Pennsylvania, the mail was slowed down. There were a lot of things that went in play. And in other places, people had to wait many, many hours to vote. That's a form of voter suppression because people can't do it. They can't take the whole day off work to vote, or they can't stand in line for physical reasons or whatever. There were lots of reasons that the Democrats had a hard time voting this year. And that was what people's concern was. Certainly my concern was that even if there were a lot of Democrats who didn't want Trump, they weren't going to be able to vote because of the pandemic, because of the lines, because of all those things. And we would end up with a close election. And if there were a close election and Donald Trump had done the things that he's doing now, we might very well have ended up with a second Trump term, because it would be really too close to tell, and there would be people being, throwing out a few votes here and finding a few votes here. And that did not happen. This election was a major win for the Democrats under these circumstances. It's very hard to take on an incumbent, and Biden won so far by more than 6 million votes. And he's won a convincing majority in the Electoral College, which I've talked a lot about the Electoral College. I'm actually not a fan, but in this case, we did not end up with a president who did not have a majority of the vote. And when he took on, it's very hard to take on an incumbent, like I said, and he has racked up the biggest win for an outsider against an incumbent since FDR in 1932. So this is not a squeaker in any way. So why am I bringing this up now? I'm bringing it up now because what is happening is something that is really important. And that is not only the president, who has shown signs, and I am not a mental health professional at all, but as a layperson, if he were my relative, I would be concerned about his mental state. It's not just him who is contesting this election, who is saying that that this election somehow has to be overturned. And the fact that we are looking at not only the president but his party willing to throw out the results of the very clear results of an election is a really big deal. It is, to my mind, disqualifying for any member of a democracy to say we're going to throw out these votes, when in fact there have been recounts. Recounts are fine. You know, I think people should make sure the votes are clear. But in the cases of the places where Trump has tried to challenge the votes, he's lost again and again and again. I think the count right now is he's won one case which said that Republicans should be allowed to stand closer to the counting tables than they were being allowed to stand in that particular venue. That's not a game changer at all. And he's lost 39. So this is not a question of anybody, you know, of there being any doubt. And yet there are not only Trump and his people, but also members of the Republican Party who are willing to overturn the clear results of a Democratic election in order to keep their person in power. And that is not okay. And we got there, as you know, I've talked a lot about the long history of the Republican Party and how it happened to get there, but it's in a real quandary. The party is in a real quandary because it has a series of policies now that are not popular. Even among people who, many people who vote Republican, or at least voted for Donald Trump this time around, they want to keep Social Security. They want to keep Medicare. They like government programs. They might be racist. They might be unaware of what's going on. They might be voting on local issues. Who knows why they're voting the way they're voting. But the Republican Party is advancing at this point a vision of the American government that says it can do nothing other than protect religion and develop a strong military. And that's the government we had before the New Deal and Eisenhower's middle way in the 1950s that began to use the government to regulate business, to have a basic social safety net, and to promote infrastructure. And most Americans like those things. They disagree about the details of them. You know, you might want one improvement and I want a different one, but we agree that there should be some intervention of the government into the economy. And the Republicans now stand against that. So they've got a real demographic problem. And the way that they have answered that demographic problem is twofold. They did it, one, by through the concept of voter fraud or voter integrity, as they started saying in the 1980s, by trying to pick their voters, to say that unless you're going to vote with us, that you're not a legitimate voter. That you are anti-American. And we've been here before. The same thing happened in the 1890s and in the early 1920s. And in that case, as it is again now, but in that case, the people against whom the party, the Americans, it was a little bit more confused in those days, turned, were African Americans. African Americans were considered illegitimate members of American society. And if you recall, in that era, lynching went through the roof. And so we've been there before, but it's not okay. That's not what a democracy is all about. So one of the things that they have done is they've tried to choose their voters by voter suppression, but they have also managed to do something through gerrymandering, which somebody asked me about, and what's going forward in gerrymandering. And the trick to gerrymandering is this: the state legislatures are the people who are in the state legislatures. The state legislators are the ones who decide what congressional voting districts look like. And probably, I've never actually looked into this, but probably when the founders were thinking about voting districts, remember, the founders had no concept of political parties, or to the degree that they did, they didn't like them. They thought that they were dangerous. They probably just thought that districts would be divided by population. But that's not what happened. Very early on, once we had the development of parties, different parties, especially under Jefferson, by the way, it's one of the reasons I'm not a fan of Jefferson, one of the reasons I'm not a fan of Jefferson. Political parties figured out that if they packed voters in a certain way, they could essentially make their candidates more likely to be elected. And what they did is they carved out these funny shapes. And the first one, which was done in Massachusetts, looked like kind of like a salamander. And the governor of Maryland, of Massachusetts at the time was Elbridge Gerry. Elbridge Gerry. It's pronounced Gary, but it's gerrymandering. Go figure. It's American history. And he didn't like the idea. He thought that this was a terrible idea, but he also didn't feel that as a governor he had the power to do something other than what the legislature wanted. So what they did is they put together this funky district that guaranteed, in that case, that a certain party would, that the legislators, the majority of the legislature divided the state of Massachusetts up in such a way that they got more people in the legislature than they would have if they just had general, we'll divide this into a grid or we'll divide this according to population. So the trick to gerrymandering is that it enables a minority to continue to win a majority of seats in a legislature. And that sounds like just ducky if you're the person in charge, right? Because your people are going to continue to win, even if you don't have a majority of the state. And you can see this really dramatically in Wisconsin right now, where it's virtually impossible for Democrats in Wisconsin to go ahead and win, even though they consistently get a majority of the popular vote. They lose the majority in the legislature by a significant amount. So it sounds like a great idea if you're in power, but it's really not. And this is what's happened to the Republican Party. What it means is that if you've gerrymandered your districts in such a way that you basically can't lose, what you need to worry about is not appealing to people who disagree with you, which would move you to the center. What you need to do is make sure that nobody's going to blindside you from your side, further on your side. So what that's done is it's moved the Republican Party farther and farther right. They don't have to worry about appealing to moderates. They have to worry about getting the people on the fringes. And so they have moved farther and farther and farther right. So for the Republican Party, they've got the issue now that they've got people in Congress who are way out there. And they really look kind of crazy to people in the middle. But at the same time, when it comes time to elect presidents, which are not elected by district, they can't sell those people because the American people are like, no, that person's crazy. So now they've got to deal with both halves of this party. And they've got the people on the far right who have a very clear sort of extremist idea about what the government should do. And they also have the problem of the fact that they can't sell that to a national audience. So what are you going to do? Well, in this case, what they appear to have done is to have thrown off the idea of democracy altogether and said, you know what, even if the vast majority of the American people don't want Donald Trump to be president, we think he should be. So we're going to overthrow democracy altogether and put him in office anyway. And that is a huge problem. It's a huge problem for Trump to want to do it. But the fact that he's got supporters in his party is something that we simply must address if we're going to continue to have a democracy. One of the ways to address that, of course, is to end gerrymandering, but that's very difficult to do because it's done by state legislatures, and when people challenge that in the Supreme Court in the last few years, the Supreme Court refused to adjust the districts based on Democrats sued saying that they couldn't have representation, and they said we can't make this determination. It has to be determined at the state level. So where are we right now with this election? As you know, probably Trump has lost all but one of his lawsuits. He can't get decent lawyers to represent him. And as of yesterday, all of the outstanding states had certified their electors for Joe Biden. So Biden's done. I mean, we're done. But there's a really big but here. And this is sort of interest. Because what happens is that the Congress is the body that has to decide whether or not these certified ballots are okay. So it has to accept these or not. And the states report them state by state. They don't all come in as a thing. You look at them state by state. And as long as there's one senator and one representative who disagree with the votes somewhere, they can hold everything up, and they can say, no, we don't agree with this. And this happened in Ohio in 2004, by the way. Nobody really pays much attention to all this stuff. Normally, it just kind of, there's a lot of this kind of almost paperwork. It's of interest to people like me because this is what I study, but your life really is complete without listening to people fighting over a state, who gets represented in a state. It always comes out in the wash. If it didn't, you'd hear about it in the news and then you'd care, but this kind of stuff happens. So it happened it always happens in one or two states. And then what happens is the Congress goes off and they talk about it and they come back and they say, yeah, you're nuts. And they go ahead and certify the way everybody expects them to. Technically, Trump is trying to get Republicans in the House and in the Senate to challenge the votes of these states that he has lost in the courts, and he lost in the vote, he's lost in the courts, he's lost in the recounts. Now he wants Republicans in the House and the Senate to refuse to accept the ballots, the electors, to refuse to accept that. And that's going to happen it's already December 1st, soon. I'm sorry, I've lost track of even what day we're on now, but it's going to happen the beginning of December. And is that going to happen? So what would happen is that, say, Matt Gaetz in the House would say, no, I disagree with the numbers here from Texas, and somebody in the Senate would say, I agree with Gaetz, they're wrong, and then Congress would have to go discuss it, and then they would have to take a majority vote on whether or not they're going to accept those results or not. And the House is not an issue because it's democratically controlled. The issue is going to be the Senate, which is right now a stronghold for the Republicans, but they've only got 52 votes, and David Perdue's term is going to run out before the new election, so it's not clear where they will be. So they're really right on the cusp of how many votes they've got. So how is that going to play out? Here's my guess. The Senate needs only a simple majority to say you're idiots. Of course, these ballots are okay, and at least 4 of those senators will do so. They've already come out and said Biden won this election. Cut it out, you people. So that's Murkowski, Collins. I forget the other 2, but in neither house are they going to go let this happen. They're just not. It's the cost is too freaking high. And I don't mean the cost for democracy. I think a lot of people in the Senate don't care about the cost for democracy. But the Senate is looking at a really bad 2022 Senate year. And they know people are going to be really angry if they pull something like this. Because remember, a majority voted for Joe Biden. This is what's so bizarre about this. It's not like in 2016 when a majority voted for Hillary Clinton, or in 2000 when a majority voted for Al Gore. This literally, the majority voted for the Democratic candidate, and nobody is arguing. Nobody except the president is saying that didn't happen. So things are a little different, and the senators, the reasonable senators, are quite aware of that, and they're not going to pull that crap 2 years before another election because they're going to lose more people in the Senate. But here's what I expect to happen. I do expect that there are going to be challenges in this counting process to all of these states. And I expect that that's going to be the case. It might not be. They might chicken out at the last minute. But I expect it's going to be the case because people have been asking about, asking me about Don Jr. running in 2024, and about Trump running in 2024, and about Ivanka, and about the Republican National Committee, which I'll tell you about. But what all this posturing is by Matt Gaetz and all those people, they don't really think Trump won. Or if they do, they're delusional. What they want to make sure is they're trying to guarantee that they can pick up Trump voters in 2024. And they want to be the guys or the women out there in front saying, I fought for you, I fought for your vote, you need to stay with me in 2024. And this is a beautiful way for them to posture toward that group of people and say, see, I defended Donald Trump right to the very end. And so I expect that you're going to see from some of these far-right Republican congressmen in the House anyway, challenges to those electors. And it's possible that some of the Freedom Caucus members in the Senate will do the same. Tom Cotton, perhaps. maybe Lindsey Graham, who knows. It's possible that they will sign on and they'll send these things to committee, and when they go to be discussed, and when they are discussed, there'll be a simple vote, and both sides will say, forget it, you're idiots. But what they're doing, not literally, but that will be the gist of it. But I think what they're doing at this point, and the reason that so many Republicans won't speak out against Trump at this point, is because they're really eager to pick up Trump voters in 2024, because it's not clear what's going to happen to the Republican Party, and they're expecting that all of the stuff that's going on now is going to be forgotten. That people are not going to be like, oh, remember it was kind of foggy after the election, but we don't really remember who did what. They're expecting that nobody's going to remember who did what. But here's a news flash. I'm a historian. I am not going to forget that there are people who put our democracy on the line for political gain. And I'm going to make sure that nobody who reads me forgets it either, because we have literally never been at this moment, a moment like this in American history. And I find it simply appalling that anybody who has taken an oath to this country would pull this kind of blatant political partisanship at the expense of our country. So that's what's going on with this election, the election shenanigans. People have asked me also about priority recognition. And what does priority recognition mean? Okay, so one of the things that I wanted to say about this is that many of you are writing to me and asking about whether it's possible for Kamala Harris to overrule Mitch McConnell based on the concept of priority recognition. And so one of the things that I'd like to point to all of you is that the sources that you've sent me are a comedian and something that purports to be some kind of a newspaper, but it's certainly something I've never seen before and doesn't have any seemingly established credentials. That's a really good sign to you that that's probably not going to happen. And priority recognition is a little bit murky. It basically just gives recognition to the floor leaders. But let me expand from that and say there's some interesting things that could happen. And I'm going to start from the premise that people probably don't think about much, and that's that, the House of Representatives has really clear rules. It's got a rules committee. It's a very powerful place to be. It's got a book of rules. They fight about those rules all the time, and they really matter, because if you screw around with the rules, you get to introduce bills, you get to do all kinds of stuff. So rules really, really matter. I mean, there's places where getting a seat on the Rules Committee literally meant the difference between, major legislation and a presidency or not. And it's one of those committees that people don't pay a lot of attention to, because you're thinking, oh, the Rules Committee, you're in charge of, I don't know, slapping the erasers. But no, it's actually really powerful. So the reason for that is because the House of Representatives, remember, when the founders wrote the Constitution, there were 13 states, and they had no reason to expect that there were going to be all that many more. They did have the concept of the ability to get new states, because out of the Articles of Confederation, under the Articles of Confederation, the Congress under the Articles had gone ahead and it had agreed to the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance is a really cool document. It's the only real reason to remember the Articles. But what the Northwest Ordinance says is that those states are not going to take colonies, that they are going to admit the people who live in the Western territories at the time into the American Union of states after they have undergone a period of sort of oversight by the federal government, because they didn't want those wild and crazy people out there in Kentucky, for example, to be able to just come in and run roughshod over these more cultured Eastern elites. But they also didn't want to hold colonies, because they thought that was a really bad idea after the American Revolution. So they did have that concept. But what they didn't have was a concept of how many of them there would be. Because remember, when they're first talking about this, the Treaty of Paris after the Revolutionary War, and by the way, I always tell my students, because Paris was the city of negotiations, like there's a gazillion treaties of Paris in American history in the early years. So if you're on Jeopardy and they ask you about some treaty and you don't know the answer, the Treaty of Paris is always a good guess, because there's so many of them. But the Treaty of Paris after the Revolutionary War establishes a boundary for the West that theoretically belongs to this new American Union, but the British government never really pulls out of the Western territories. They move up to Canada and sort of out west a little bit into the forts out west, where they kind of hunker down and wait for America to tear itself apart. So the founders never really expected that there was going to be this giant, that there were going to be 50 states. I mean, it's not until 1803 that we get the Louisiana Purchase, after all, that's going to double the size of the United States. And then 1848 that gives us the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is going to give, almost give another major quarter of the U.S. Territory. And then after, in the 1860s, Alaska, and then Hawaii at the turn of the late 19th century. So they just don't foresee that. So what happens is, as these new states come in the early Republic, which is the early Republic period, is the time from the Revolution, the Constitution through the Civil War. As these new states come in, the House of Representatives has a real problem because it's gotten too big. And they have to have rules because people don't know each other, and there are a lot of them, and they don't agree about very much. And they're often don't really know how to do things. They serve 2 years in Congress. They serve 2 terms in Congress, and they really need a rule book. So the House of Representatives gets a very clear set of rules by, the 1860s at the latest, and that's after the South leaves. So when the Republicans in Congress are rebuilding the House in the 1860s, they have very clear systems. And by the 1870s and the 1880s, man, they are really running that place like a top, right? They have real issues. The Senate, on the other hand, stays small. The Senate doesn't need to have all those rules because they're a really small group of people, because there's only 2 per state. So the Senate never develops the kind of really hidebound rules that the House does. And it sees itself as more sort of a collegial group of, I hate to say friends, but yeah, they all know each other really well. They serve for a gazillion years. And they tend to be bossed around informally by the people who have the most power, because they know the most, or they have the most money, or they run the war chest for the Republican Party. That happens at the turn of the century. And so the Senate never really develops rules. It has rules, but not the kind of hidebound rules where everybody has a role the way the House of Representatives does. So why do I bring all this up? You're asking about what's going to happen with Kamala Harris, because the vice president is technically the head of the Senate, although we haven't done much with that in the 20th century, really. So the reason I mention this is because the idea of priority recognition as being some extra special thing that Kamala Harris can invoke to work around Mitch McConnell, my guess is not. But there are a bunch of things that could happen that have not happened yet. So, for example, this whole concept of this extraordinarily powerful Senate Majority Leader, this is really new under Mitch McConnell. That doesn't have to stay. Now, one of the tricks to the Senate, though, is you have to be able to change the rules by a majority vote. And right now, the Republicans have that majority vote. But first of all, we have 2 elections coming up in Georgia, and we have 2022. So my point here is that probably not priority recognition, but who knows what the vice president could do? There's a lot more vagueness in the Senate than there is in the House of Representatives. The filibuster, another thing that's left over from the 19th century, when the Senate was small enough that you could get away with that. The House got rid of that in the early 19th century because it was too big. You couldn't get anything done. Well, it's almost like the Senate in the modern world has outgrown the Senate rules, and the Senate's going to have to figure out how to fix those. But there is also, for all that, one of the things that I'm seeing in the news is a lot of Republicans sort of throwing up their hands and going, oh, the Democrats have to work with us. They shouldn't do anything extreme because, oh, that'll be such a bad precedent. And I'm looking at that and going, are you kidding me? Like, the Republicans have played with bayonets in the Senate now for at least, 12 years. And the idea that somehow now they need to be welcomed back as part of a happy little family seems to me to be more than a little bit far-fetched. And there are many other things that one could do to pull the Senate into line. And one of the ones, and I am not recommending in any way that this be used, but just to let you know there's a lot of stuff out there, is that um, according to the Constitution, the president has the power to not dissolve, but to adjourn to adjourn Congress. If the House and the Senate cannot agree to a time to adjourn, the president can do it. Now, I'm not suggesting this should happen, but it is certainly possible, as a friend of mine suggests, for Nancy Pelosi to refuse to agree with Mitch McConnell to adjourn, and that would then send the right to adjourn the Congress to Biden, which would then give him the ability to do whatever he wanted to do during a congressional recess. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that's a good solution. I'm suggesting that there are plenty of ways that the Senate might be able to be forced into doing something. Because right now, of course, it's not sustainable the way that it is with Mitch McConnell, a senator from a small state, being able to hold up all legislation simply because he has the control over the calendar, which is essentially why the majority leader is so powerful. And that's just stupid. I mean, it is what it is, but that's just stupid. He has gotten this power because he took it. And as I say, this is one thing that the collegial Senate never guarded against in a way that the House of Representatives did. All right, so that's one thing. You asked about that. Now, people have asked me about, where do you want me to go next? I'm going to go here into some quick questions and then perhaps back to the Republican Party, as you've asked me to. People have asked me what I think about Biden's cabinet posts. And I'm very interested by them. And I'm interested in them because there's for a number of reasons. I mean, obviously, because I'm interested in the cabinet anyway, but because you will see instantly that there is a split on the left between progressives who are very angry at a number of Biden's posts and institutionalists who are like, these people are great. And let me say this about that argument. Biden's got a problem because he's got to get his cabinet people through the Senate. And the Senate under Mitch McConnell has made it very clear that they have no intention of working in any reasonable way with Biden at all. So what he has done is threading the needle, in my mind, to just an absolutely beautiful way. And that is that he has picked extraordinarily qualified people. Extraordinarily qualified. So, I mean, again, look at the fact that we now got Chad Wolf theoretically being nominated by Donald Trump to be the head of Homeland Security, where he's been acting Homeland Security head for way longer than was legal for him to be there. Chad Wolf has no resume at all. The reason he never actually nominated him is because he never would have gotten through. He's not qualified. But Biden has taken people who have or has nominated people who have resumes as long as your arm, and they are not in any way controversial resumes. So somebody like Elizabeth Warren was going to have a hard time getting through the Senate because they don't like her stance against people, the financiers who are, have really stacked the deck in their own favor. And so he has gone with institutionalists, and he's gone with people that's going to be really, really hard for the Senate to say no to. Now, that being said, when you've heard me say this before, if you are concerned that they are that those institutionalists are too moderate, put pressure on them. I mean, as I've always said, Joe Biden is at the center of the Democratic Party. So if you don't like where he is, push him further to the left. And that's the role, to my mind, that's always been the role of progressives in American history, is they push the institutionalists in the direction that they want them to go. So that's one thing about his cabinet appointments, that he's got to be careful about who he picks. But never forget that that this is multidimensional chess. So I mentioned Elizabeth Warren quite deliberately there because Elizabeth Warren is a Democrat from the state of Massachusetts. And Massachusetts changes its law fairly frequently about the appointment of senators who resign or whatever for some reason. And right now, I believe that the governor would be able to appoint a Democrat to that position. I think literally they change it all the time. But remember that the governor of Massachusetts, who would be filling Elizabeth Warren's seat, gets to appoint whomever he wants, and he's a Republican.
So whenever you're seeing thinking, and same with Bernie Sanders, and is I believe the governor of Vermont is also a Republican, and he has the right to fill that seat with a Republican. Well, there goes your Democratic majority or your Democratic power in the Senate. So all of that has to be figured in. And you also have to look at what somebody's skills are. Now, Elizabeth Warren's skills are really very institutional skills. She's really good at what she does. Bernie Sanders is not. His skill has always been at rallying people behind him and selling them on an idea. And that's not a small thing. That's a really important thing. But do you need that in your cabinet? No. I mean, your cabinet is really about sort of inside moles. It's not about rallying people behind you. That's where you need somebody like Bernie Sanders in the Senate, where he can actually be out giving stump speeches. When was the last time you heard a stump speech from a cabinet person? All right, so that's two things about the cabinet. Here's the other piece about the cabinet, though, that is really interesting to me, and I wrote about it very briefly last night. And that's that this cabinet that Biden has pulled together so far, and the people he's appointing, is unique. It is the first in American history that makes an effort to really look like the American people. And that's fascinating to me because one of the tenets of the Democratic Party from the very beginning, one of the reasons that Jackson is known as a political thinker, which always shocks me. I mean, I never think of him as a thinker, but he kind of was. He got forced into it because he was so mad about the election of 1824. But he says it's really important. In his case, he was just trying to get rid of the professional politicians that had turned against him in 24. But he articulates that it's very important. I mean, the real question on the table when in the 1820s, right? You've had the Revolution, and then the Virginia dynasty, and then you have the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 is the war that pushes those British away from the western frontier, the way I was talking about, and basically convinces them that in fact America is a going concern, that it's going to really exist. It's not going to fall into not going to fall into quarreling factions, and Britain's not going to come take it back over. So after the War of 1812, you get this period in the 1820s known as the era of good feelings, and that's when Americans are like, hey, this is great, we're a country. But what does that even mean? Like, what is a democracy? And this is why you get books like Tocqueville's Democracy in America. He's a Frenchman. He's coming over to look at the prison system, but he writes this book about what is democracy. And then you've got, all these visitors who are writing books about what literally is a democratic government. We talk about it easily now, but what is it? Like, how do you do that? How do you create a group of men in this period who can govern a wide group of people and not become like a monarchy or some kind of an elite group that oversees everybody else? I mean, how does this idea of democracy not devolve into, basically a hierarchy where you've got this professional class that kind of, puts all the money in their own pockets and ends up being, sort of overlords? Like, how does that happen? And they don't know, and they spend a lot of time wondering about it. And this is actually where you're going to get the early flowering of American literature. In the 1830s, they actually create this new magazine called the Democratic Review, when they're literally trying to teach people what it means to be a member of a democracy. And this is where Walt Whitman gets his start, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Herman Melville. They're all experimenting with the ideas of democracy. So I'm really going to spare you and not go on a whole diatribe here about Moby Dick, but that's what they are trying to do, is figure out. So Andrew Jackson comes into this, and I'm not going to give you Andrew Jackson's whole story, but after he loses out on the election of 1824, and it's not at all like the other elections of 1876 and 1888 and 2000 and 2016, where somebody else gets all the votes, and the Electoral College gives the presidency to somebody else. People often throw the election of 24 in there, and it's a completely different story. It's an interesting story, but a very different story. Anyway, he wins the most votes in 24, but they're split 4 ways, and so he doesn't. At the end of the day, Henry Clay throws his votes to John Quincy Adams. So Andrew Jackson doesn't go into the White House, and he's really pissed off about it, as only Andrew Jackson can be, right? So he sits down and he argues that, in fact, the real problem with this whole new, this is 24, with this whole new democratic idea is that it's getting this group of people in charge of it who are becoming professionals who are out of touch with ordinary Americans. So he literally articulates, and again, we don't have parties really yet. We certainly don't have the Democratic Party. It's going to form around him. So in the formation of the Democratic Party, he says we need to go ahead and create a democratic, small d, democratic governmental system that is run by ordinary Americans who look like the regular people. The government must essentially, in order to be a good democracy, the government essentially must be the people put into positions of power. They can't be, this elite political class. They must be the people put into positions of power. And of course, he means his own people, and he means white men. He means all that. But that has been a piece of the Democratic Party ever since. And you can see how that has played out in the modern era when you get Republicans, for example, talking about the Democrats doing identity politics, which is a real misnomer because the Republicans are doing the exact same thing. It's just that their identity is white and white male. But the Democrats in 1972, after the disaster of the 1968 Democratic National Convention, in which a bunch of professional politicians essentially overrode the popular will in the Democratic Party and gave the nomination in 68 to Hubert Humphrey. They rewrote their rules in 72, under George McGovern actually. They rewrote their rules and they said, no, we've got to go ahead and make sure the Democratic Party actually looks like the American people. So into the Democratic Committee and into the Democratic National Convention, they literally put slots for women and people of color and made sure that it was going to be more representative. And that, of course, opened the door for Republicans to say, oh, you're just about quotas. But what it was an attempt to go ahead and honor this idea that a democratic, small d government should look like the people. Okay, bringing that back to Biden's cabinet, Biden, having done this, his comms team is all women, which I thought was fascinating. Kayleigh McEnany goes, well, so's Trump's. And it's like, no, it's not. I'm watching these guys. They're all men. Not all. Kayleigh's a woman, but I didn't even know how she defined that. I thought that was a really weird moment. But the fact that he is deliberately saying, yeah, I want African Americans on my team. I want Indians on my team. I want Hispanic people on my team because they are Americans. And the thing about that is when you put a woman in charge of the Office of Management and Budget, which again, most people are like, what's the OMB? It doesn't matter. Well, it does, because the OMB is the office that really can look at a proposal and say, we can't afford that. That's nuts. Or this is really important. We need this. Or in the case of Donald Trump, it was the Office of Management and Budget that stopped the payments to Vladimir Zelensky in the summer of 2019 when he was desperately trying to fight off the Russians. When you put a woman in charge of the OMB, you very well might have a different perspective than when you put McElvaney in charge of it. A white man who is part of an ideological program, rather than putting Mayor Tandem in charge of it. So his cabinet posts are important because they're moderate institutionalists and they'll get through the Senate. Because they are and because they are sort of an honoring of this democratic tradition, but because how can you look at a group of these people who are women and people of color and white men, of course, but look at them and say they're not going to be any different than we've had in the past? They are unique. And to me, it looks like Biden is jumping out of the box saying, we're in a new era and I'm going to, he's not, for all that this is a moderate group of people in terms of their resumes, this is not a moderate set of appointments. This is the kind of thing, again, I always think about what's going to end up in the history books. His appointments so far have been not radical ideologically, but radical in terms of saying, look at what the Trump administration looked like. It was virtually all white. It was virtually all male. He's saying, no, my cabinet is going to reflect the American people, and that's going to be a very different kind of politics. So that's what I think about that. All right. Somebody asked just now, I saw it go by, about Trump going ahead and announcing he's running in 2024. Of course he is. He's using even this whole thing about having lost I won the election. He's putting money in his own pocket. I mean, he's raising money based on this, and these poor suckers are literally paying for his lawyers. And now one of his super PACs, he can use that money for things like memberships to golf courses. I mean, it's a grift. It's really disgusting, to be honest. All right, so yeah, of course he's going to announce he's going to run for office. He's probably going to hold something on Inauguration Day. All we can hope, not all we can hope, he's going to have real legal troubles beginning on January 21st, and I think you can see those walls closing in, and that's why he's freaking out. Okay, so the question there I just saw going by because. Yes, that Biden wants to do all this stuff, but we still have to contend with McConnell in the Senate. Yes, that's true. And McConnell is, I think, again, it's appalling that he can stop things even from coming to a vote, which he should not be able to do. Again, the rules need to change, but there's a couple of things that one can do about that. One is put pressure on your senators. Two, work for the Georgia elections. But three, change the political conversation. Mitch McConnell and the people who support him are not young. They are not going to live forever. And he's already 78 years old, and there's other ways that Biden can work around him, including through executive orders. Somebody asked about the changing that Trump has done by changing this executive order to remove the protections from a bunch of political appointees so they can be fired. But he has also put protections on them so they can't be fired for political reasons. Yes, he's trying to pack the government with his own people, and people have asked, can Biden overturn that? Sure, he can make that change when he gets out, but that's going to be very hard when those positions are already packed because of the conditions under which they were packed. Again, these are things that there will be solutions to. I mean, again, speaking of boxes, for 4 years, everybody has felt they had to work around Donald Trump because he was president. He's not going to be president anymore, and we get to decide what things are going to look like. The president of the United States remains one of the most powerful people in the world. 4 years ago, I would have said it was the most powerful position in the world. And he's not simply going to say, oh, oopsie poopsie, I can't do it because Trump has boxed me in. He's going to find a way around it. But we have to help and say, this is what I want. As I said the other day, as Tip O'Neill said, yeah, what you think is a great idea, now make me do it. It's our need to make people do it. Okay, so a couple of more things here. You've asked about pardons. Can Trump pardon preemptively? Yes, he can, or at least so it appears. That's what Gerald Ford did for Nixon. He pardoned him for crimes for which Nixon had not yet been indicted, never was. And if you look at the language of the Flynn pardon, it's absolutely extraordinary. It's like they came up with every possible verb they could to make sure that Flynn could never be prosecuted for anything that came out of the Mueller report or anything having to do with the Russia investigation. And, Trump is saying, well, that's because it was unfair. No, of course it wasn't. Even the Senate Intelligence Committee report, which was written by Republicans, says, yeah, there was collusion going on. Collusion is not a legal term, by the way, so that's one of the reasons it's been hard to define. He said absolutely this was going on, and of course Flynn was in the middle of it. So the larger question and the more interesting question is whether or not Trump can pardon for a crime in which he is implicated. And right now, of course, Flynn's pardon stays, but the question is what happens when the intelligence material becomes available to this president, who has the power to declassify it the same way Trump had the power to declassify things. So certainly Democrats know what's in many of those reports, including the full Mueller report that has not been redacted, but and other things as well. But they don't have the power to come out and say it. But this president could say so. And I think this is one of the other reasons that Trump is desperate not to leave office. I think he thought that he was going to be reelected either by fair means or foul. And now he knows that all that material that has been kept under wraps is now about to come out or could come out. And I think he is absolutely frantic about that. So can Trump pardon people? Of course he can. And that's an old tradition. But he should not be able to pardon if he's implicated in the crime. And that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the next year or so. Finally, you people have asked me about, somebody asked, is there any way to keep Trump from selling our secrets to Russia? So this is a real problem. And my guess is we're going to find out that not you and me, not in our lifetimes, but historians are going to be able to get someday into the records of other countries and discover that, in fact, there have been that our security has not been secure. I mean, if you remember that Jared Kushner could not get security clearance until his father-in-law gave him one, and that I suspect would be the case kind of across the board. It's a little bit much now that Senator Cornyn, for example, has said he is appalled at the idea that people who work for foreign governments might be working in the Biden administration, when of course that was the hallmark of the Trump administration. But so I think we're going to find out that's already happened. There have already been moves among the intelligence community to say that Trump should not continue to get briefings, although presidents generally do continue to get security briefings after they've been elected. My guess is that one's going to come out in the wash, but I do think that we will need to be looking very closely at things like this sale of $23 billion of equipment, military equipment, to the UAE over the wishes of Republicans and Democrats, both in Congress. That seems to, at this very late moment, that seems to me to be deeply problematic, giving our F-35 technology to the UAE, who's wanted it for a long time, and to anybody who happens to be able to observe it in the UAE, including Russia and China are expected to be able to take a look at what that F-35 plane looks like. So another couple of questions here. People have asked me about the history of the Fairness Doctrine and about the future of the GOP. And so somebody has just asked about assassination, and maybe that's a good place to be for me here. And that's that I don't talk about that in American history almost ever. I do mention, of course, when I teach the survey. But I want to be very clear that when anybody ever makes any kind of a comment like that in my comments, even joking, I erase it. And the reason for that is, first of all, because of the obvious moral implications of that. But second of all, because I challenge anybody to sit there and think of a moment in American history where that sort of assumption of power by an individual has turned out well. Like, you might have fantasies about how much better things would go without one person or another in politics. But when, tell me when that case was. And don't literally tell me that case here, because I actually can think of one. But for the most part, any kind of violence like that is always an expletive disaster. So I like to tamp that down amongst my followers, as well as I hope other people are tamping it down, and I know they're not. So that's not a direction that we want to go. Couple more things here that I'm going to wrap together very quickly. And I'll talk about them more at some other point if anybody's interested. The first is a history of the Fairness Doctrine, because I talk a lot about the Fairness Doctrine, because I do blame the end of the Fairness Doctrine for where we are now, because it permitted there to be a kind of media in America that was untethered from reality and that offered a really easy narrative for people. A narrative, by the way, that Eisenhower was furious about, because it enabled them to abdicate people to abdicate their right to be their need to be informed citizens to participate in a democracy. And that was the end of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987 under Ronald Reagan, when he had put his own appointees on the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. And what that did is, when we had the Fairness Doctrine, it said that for you to own a broadcast license, you had to present arguments fairly, they had to be fact-based, and you had to present both sides of the questions, so that people, if you were going to argue in favor of, a new bridge, you had to have somebody else who argued against it. And somebody wanted to know where we got that Fairness Doctrine. And we got that Fairness Doctrine out of a moment that feels much like the present. And that was the late 19th century, when we'd had very partisan press in the middle of the 19th century, when you first got the rise of what was considered newspapers in the 1840s. We had newspapers before that, but they tended to be sort of what an educated man needed to know. So it wasn't breaking news. It was sort of like, well, there was a coup in wherever, 2 months ago kind of stuff. This is, the newspapers in the middle of the 19th century literally were breaking news, and they early on were politically oriented, because really newspapers didn't make enough money to survive. So the way that printers afforded to be able to print newspapers was to get contracts from a political party, or from that political party when it was in the legislature, to print bills and things like that. So they tended to be very political. And after the Civil War, they pretty quickly, as the political situation after the Civil War gets quite muddy, a number of newspapers led by the New York Times actually begin to call themselves independent. So it becomes a little bit harder to tell if somebody's a Democrat or a Republican by about the 1880s. And they tend to be independent, and then the big papers, and then, although they do obviously support one candidate or another. And then by about the late 1890s, you get the rise of penny papers, and they are much like the kind of stuff we get on the internet now, where they tell a sensationalized story. They're known as the yellow press, and they push the Spanish-American War, and they do it really as a competition to get circulation. And after that, there is this sense that the news must be cleaned up. And we get the rise of this idea of an independent press that doesn't try and steer the way people think, but only prints the news, what is actually happening, only the facts, so that other people can readers can make their decisions. And that works just fine until Joe McCarthy learns to weaponize that by making crazy news, and that gets coverage, so it sounds like it's true even if it's not. And you can see this really weaponized by, if you remember, Newt Gingrich giving speeches to the empty Congress in the middle of the night, so they showed up on C-SPAN with him making really provocative comments, and it got press coverage, so that's how Gingrich got so much press coverage. And now, of course, you see it with Donald Trump doing the same thing, like I wrote about how them putting Nazi insignia, for example, in some of their campaign literature, because then it gets picked up by the news and they get free coverage. Anyway, so they come up with this system in the early 19th century, and when we get the rise of radio in the 1920s, in order to get a broadcast license, the Federal Communications Commission says you got to be fair about this. In order to get a broadcast license and not poison our public discourse, you have to have this Fairness Doctrine. And it gets picked up, of course, by the news media, the television news media after that, when we really get the broadcasting of television news taking off in the 1950s. And this, of course, falls apart in 1987 when we let the Fairness Doctrine lapse. And when we get the lapse of the Fairness Doctrine, we get the rise of this movement conservative ideology that sells itself with a simple narrative of an individual fighting against this dangerous state that Ronald Reagan talks about, and that now has gotten us to the point where we have a reality TV president who is literally saying that we should, as of today on Twitter, that we should throw out the results of the last election. And this is not a sustainable situation for a democracy. So that's the history of the Fairness Doctrine. And I've run out of time to talk about what I see as the future of the Republican Party, but we have plenty of time to talk about that. I'm sorry, this is a little bit off the cuff. We still don't have electricity. You can probably hear my generator in the background. But I will be back next Thursday. I'll be back tonight. I hope I should be able to post tonight a letter. And then I'll be back next Thursday if you guys are still interested with some kind of history. Still figuring that one out. Anyway, thanks for being here. My name is Heather Cox Richardson, professor of history. Don't speak for my employer. And thanks for being here, and I will see you on Thursday. Being here, and I will see you on Thursday.